All right. So we're talking about technology and classical education. And before we dive in, we have to get some terms defined here. Technology, in a certain sense, means the work of human hands. I think anymore, we can probably assume it means something with like computers or smartphones or something of that nature. So something that's not necessarily there naturally, but is made and coaxed along by human hands. And the second thing to define here is classical education. There's a lot of different definitions for that term, classical education. And when I think about it, um, the main thing that comes to my mind is to kind of differentiate it between, I guess, what would be non-classical education. And so a lot of times when we educate, we go to education, we think about useful skills. The number one thing I always hear in classes, when am I ever going to use this again? Uh, that betrays kind of this almost like utilitarian. I'm here to get like practical hard skills, usefulness. The main thing is to be like useful in society, to be economically viable, to do better at the next level of education, that kind of thing. So there's measuring of performances and stuff like that as kind of the goal. Classical education has as the goal an orientation to reality. Right? Um, it helps the human person become a good person by setting that person inside a tradition that's been handed on to them down through the ages so that they can gain wisdom and be in touch with the real. Okay? Um, and so through that, to find happiness, to thrive as a human being would be the goal of classical education. And the method is not to just sit with whatever is kind of a trend now, but to look at what is true and good and endearing. You look at what there is now, but you put it into conversation with what has gone before. So it's a handing on of a tradition and a lens so that you can thrive by interacting with what's real, I guess, is a just simple way to define some terms here. And just in those definitions, we're starting to hear the interesting back and forth between how do these two things work, especially in the AI age. How does technology fit into classical education? So, to answer this question, we're going to do a little great books discussion. We're going to look at the tradition. We're going to analyze the lens and the viewpoint that we're given through our tradition, especially through scripture. And then we're going to look at our experience and we're going to learn some principles and some practical applications of those principles so that we can thrive using technology rather than languish using technology. It's the thing that kind of concerns me. There's so much tech now. There's so many advancements in like smartphone technology, stuff like that, that a whole new industry is emerging, and that is the industry that promises a solution or a way out of technology. So interesting time to have this conversation. It's an interesting thing to put into conversation with this technological age is this classical education mindset. So let's dive in. First off, one of the sources I want to look at, I talked about scripture. We're going to dial forward, I guess, a little bit into some of the Socratic dialogues written by Plato. Socrates, he has a really interesting dialogue on this very topic. It's not the centerpiece of the dialogue, but it's definitely dealt with. In the Phaedrus, one of the questions that Socrates is batting around with his interlocutors is the benefit of the written word. Is it a good thing that we're developing these technologies of the book and our language in a written form and things like that? Is that a good thing? Is that going to help us thrive? Is that going to make us wiser and better? And he has some concerns, and I think his concerns are really kind of profound. It's interesting that he's worried about the book, and in our technology, we're trying to hold on to the book, and we're worried about the devices and things that replace the book. So it's just interesting to look back and see the debate then was about the thing that we're trying to uphold now. I think that says something about technology, but you can bat that one around in your mind. But in general, his concern is wisdom is a living thing. It's almost like a breathing thing that's shared between the conversation, the dialogue with another. It's almost like the breath that's shared between the two. That's a dialogue. I breathe out words, you breathe out words. We're sitting and exchanging ideas. It's a dialogos, it's an exchange of words and ideas. And he's worried that writing it down and kind of capturing those ideas without putting a face and a voice and an experience to it takes the life away from the pursuit of wisdom. It's an interesting thing. He also says that it's easier, without the face to face delivery, it's easier to be deceived by things like sophistry. Like maybe someone can write eloquently, but they're not actually wise. And when I take the face away, I'm just seeing their wisdom on a page, and there's no, well, there's supposed wisdom on a page, and maybe there's no wisdom there. Right? There's a risk of being deceived, a greater risk of being deceived than how, well, he would do things, which is engage in a discussion, a back and forth. Right? He's also concerned that we'll lose memory, lose our capacity to have those stories within us. Right? So some of the great schools of philosophy and theology, you think about the early Greek poetic tradition, where they would hand down poetry by verbatim memorizing the great epics. So you get different versions, but by and large, I think a lot of people think oral tradition is this idea of one person saying something, another person saying the same story, but they're elaborating or lying or adding different things, so you get different versions. It's like a version of, like, you know, your uncle's escapades at last Christmas, and then the more you tell the story year by year, it gets more outlandish. But that's not the case with oral tradition. They painstakingly memorized word for word these important texts, and then they handed them on. The other tradition I think of is the tradition of the Old Testament, where even in Jesus' time, schooling was memorizing verbatim the texts of first the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and then for those that had more proficiency, the rest of the books, and then tradition or teaching on them. Right? So that the idea there is that you have your scripture with you at all times. Right? It's memorized, it's there, you can access it. The poem is part of your mind. It's formed you, right? And that's an interesting thing, especially for our discussion of classical education, with this, which especially at the grammar level has a lot of like memorization as part of that component, because when it's in you, it becomes part of you. And he's worried that if we don't have that memory, if we're always kind of going back to our books, it doesn't become a part of us in the way that it should. That we could just read massive amounts of things, but never actually be formed or nourished by it. These are great concerns, right? So there's kind of what's at the center of our debate about technology. Yeah, he's talking about books and things like that in a specific technology, but in a certain sense, you lose part of that thing that forms your mind. You lose part of that thing of what it means to be human a bit. It removes you, in a certain sense, from the natural, from having your fingers in the dirt, so to speak. Okay? And that's what we should be asking when it comes to technology. Okay? To add a little bit more, let's look at the biblical tradition, the biblical story or lens, when it comes to technology. What is the story of technology in the first pages of the Bible? So we're just going to look really at the first 11 chapters of Scripture. This is, if you've ever seen the Lord of the Rings movie, the first scene is like 10 or 12 minutes long, and it tells the big epic story of the ring, the backstory. It has kind of a legend or a mythical element, and then it zooms in on Frodo, and then you see the Hobbit, and you're into the story. First 11 chapters of Genesis is kind of like the big story, and then it zooms in on Abraham at the end of Genesis 11 into Genesis 12. So we could say the first 11 chapters are the prologue that's giving us the big story and giving us the lens, the big cosmic lens that we should view things in before it dives into the historical account of God's people and eventually the Messiah that rises from God's people and brings us into covenant with God. So let's look at the big lens that's being given to us, and then we'll take the thoughts here from Socrates, we'll take this story, we'll try and form some principles around education and how to use technology well, and we'll go from there. So the first stop when it comes to technology, the very first piece of techne in Scripture, the work of human hands, is kind of surprising. I thought about this after someone pointed it out to me. Said really the first thing made by humans was the loincloth of fig leaves made by Adam and Eve. I thought that was very interesting. It's kind of true. Their goal, they are given a job to till and to keep the garden. It's not just their goal, that's a bad word. It's their purpose. They're given a purpose, a certain work. To till is like a gardening thing. You're taking the earth and you're cultivating it to bring more out of the earth than what's there. So they're meant to be cultivators of God's creation. He could have done all of this in and of himself, but he wants to share this great work of creation with us. So we're like sub-creators of his work. We get to cultivate and build up and rule his good creation. And there's two trees situated in this garden that they're put in to cultivate. And in some way, shape, or form, this garden and these trees and this work also has like a defensive, almost like military aspect to it as well, because not only are they tilling and keeping, but these trees in this garden are in need of defending. They're tilling and they're keeping. The word keep in Hebrew is shamar. They're supposed to defend this creation, this realm that God has given to them. Right? And what's there to defend? Well, it's a garden, but it's named Eden, and in Hebrew, that means delight or happiness, right? Which is the goal. It's what we're there for. So they're there to till and to keep and to multiply this happiness that they're given. Right? And the trees inside the garden, they have names. The tree of life was situated in Genesis 2 in the middle of the garden. Let me surprise you, because in Genesis 3, it's the other tree that Eve points out as being in the middle of the garden, and that's the first one that we usually think of. But in Genesis 2, it explicitly says the tree of life is placed in the middle of the garden. It says, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Like it's almost like a throwaway. It's there too. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, knowing good and evil, doesn't mean that they were dumb. It doesn't mean that they didn't have wisdom. They have more wisdom in their pinky finger than we have now. Right? They lost more wisdom than we've gained in our life, right? Because of the supernatural graces of God given to them that elevated their nature. But the second tree, it's almost like a door out of happiness. It's this free choice. It's a gift that we're given to work with our hands and to cultivate in, well, God's image is what we're made to do it, but we have an option. So that's the door out. By the time Eve engages in her conversation with the serpent, she says, or she sees things differently. She says that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is in the middle of the garden, right? This knowing of good and evil, this ability to commune and redefine things, right? So she has looked at God's design and she's redesigned it in her own mind. Like, this is better. Like, what's the source and summit of happiness? It's the knowledge of good and evil. It's not life with God anymore, right? You could say that taking from that tree symbolizes using that gift of God, the work of human hands, to cultivate the world, using the mind and using the soul and all the things that God has given to us. We could either do that the way God intended, or we could build up the world in our own image. And that's what she does. She redefines happiness. She redefines the garden to be based on something else. And as soon as they fall, their work of cultivation becomes something else. They actually start to mask what was naturally there, right? They use it to hide from each other. And this picture that we have to help us think about this story, they're being sent out of the garden, and you can see them wandering into the rocks and the thistles and things. They're not wearing loincloths anymore of leaves. They're wearing the aprons given to them by God, right? God takes their techne and he shows them a better way. He gives them a better gift, something that can clothe them and equip them better for this wandering. They've lost the garden, but God is already multiplying their work. It's also interesting to think why that gift. It's a better gift, but also it's dead stuff. They're covered in dead animal skins. right? They used to shine like the stars, but now through their work, they're covered in dead animal skins. Like, yikes, right? And as you follow their story, their sons compete with each other, the famous Cain and Abel, and Cain kills Abel, and then he wanders even further. And the story of it's actually it's not much of a story. It's a list of names that we find usually pretty boring, and we skip over it in Genesis 5. But that list of names is an epic tale of the descendants of Cain. And there's a couple things that you notice as the descendants grow, they become masters of uh, techne, of this work of human hands. They cultivate, right? They make things out of metal. They make instruments and music. They learn how to domesticate animals. They make tents, like you're describing. These are good things, but they're doing things again, not using this nature and these things I think God intended for us. They're not using these things for cultivating God's creation. They're using it to build up their own image, right? To actually wreck God's creation to the point where God looks down and says, I'm going to ultimately turn them over to the flood to cleanse my world. Right? So this techne really takes off. And the very last chapter in this prologue part of the Bible gives us a showdown between the brick and the rock, the stone, the natural stone, where they discover how to make bricks and they're going to make a tower. These are the generations that come from Noah and especially his son Ham. So the Canaanites, Ham's son is Canaan, the Canaanite people. They build a civilization themselves out of these giant men, these kings, and they learn how to make the brick. And instead of the mountains that God has created, they said, we can do one better. We can make a tower that will go up into the heavens. And when they're in the heavens, how they viewed the world in like ancient cosmology was that the stars were like divine beings up in the heavens. And so these early humans were like, well, we're going to get up there with the stars and we can make ourselves equal to them, maybe even throw them down. And it says that they're going to make a name for themselves. They're going to redefine things. They're going to rename things, right? Remember, Adam's original work was to name things, but he consulted with God. And by naming, he's not saying, hey, you're a cheetah and you're a platypus. He's like, and God's like, hey, way to go, buddy. That was a good one. Porcupine is especially a favorite. That's not what's going on. What's really going on is he's understanding creation. He's becoming the scientist that reads the book of nature that God wrote as he begins to learn, how do I cultivate this? Well, instead they say, we're not going to look at the names that God intended and consult with him. We're going to make a name for ourselves. We're going to build our own mountains, our own high places. I remember Eden, there were 4 rivers that streamed out of Eden and watered the whole land. That shows that Eden is situated on a high place itself. So we're going to make a new Eden. We're going to do things in our own way. And you see hints of this again in like the slavery in Egypt and different places, how people are using technology. But God has a different way. Throughout the story of the patriarchs, they build their own altars out of natural stones. Like there's an injunction to make natural stones their altars, right? So we have the idea of God in his creation, the natural stone, versus the brick, our own stone, right? Now, notice the difference between the natural stone and the brick. It's taking God's creation and doing something with it. They elevate the stones, the patriarchs, by making them into sites of worship. Right? This is kind of what technology is meant to do, to cultivate creation, to beautify creation, and offer it back to God as a type of worship. Right? Now, what has God done with creation? I think sometimes we're very doom and gloom when it comes to technology. So let's look at what God has done with these pieces of techne. Right? So, to the story of Socrates, what has God done with a book? Well, he's given us the scriptures. Right? He's handed these things down. We have the prayers of the church. We have the missal. We have the psalms. We have our beautiful hymns. We have whole educations and the forming of minds and souls because of this book. Yeah, maybe we have lost some of those things that Socrates feared, but what has God done with it as well? Right? We look at, we're still covered in dead stuff. this great symbol of our fallen nature. We're supposed to shine like the stars, be clothed in the light, and yet here we are in dead stuff. But we have found a way to offer that back as worship to God. Think of the beautiful vestments. Think of what we do with clothing now to adorn the body, how we use it to grow in modesty, to accentuate the beauty by concealing those things which ought to be concealed, right? How he's elevated our fallen technology, right? Think about all the cultivation of the Canaanites, right? The instruments that they had, how David was able to create these psalms and these songs as a picture of David on the screen out of that music, out of that fallen society, right? Or the brick itself. Look what God has done with the brick. He built huge temples, and then that temple became an icon of an even greater temple, so that when it fell physically, it's not gone. He says that we now have become the temple. St. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians, or he cries out to the Corinthians, don't you know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit? And without the brick in this great place of worship, which we still use these to create places of worship. But without these, we wouldn't have this great icon for what God has done in our soul. So look what God can do with technology, right? And to go back to a conversation I actually had with students, we were doing a summer book club a few years ago where we were reading Lord of the Rings. I think this was a Mr. Walsh insight. Another one of the teachers had this insight in the middle of joining one of these conversations. He said there's two ways that in Lord of the Rings you see technology being used, right? It's a classical education thing, and a lot of us have homeschooling background. You got to get Lord of the Rings in there somewhere. So here we are. There's two different ways that creation is being used and cultivated in Lord of the Rings as great icons for technology. You have the orcish technology, right? Remember, the orcs have been, they've taken the nature of elves, they're originally elves, and they've been warped to the ends, like the nefarious ends of Sauron, or Saruman is fusing orcs and men and goblins and things to make Orca and stuff, but their natures are being warped or corrupted. And their technology, their war machines, destroy things to dominate creation. And that's different than the elves. The elves have their own technology, but they take things that naturally aid and they build up upon the nature of the thing. So you think of like the lembas bread. Well, bread nourishes, but the bread that the elves make nourishes like almost supernaturally. Right? It nourishes even more. So they're taking what's there and they're cultivating it. It's that kind of like organic rock thing. We're taking something that's there and we're elevating it. Right? So we can be orcish with our technology and use it to dominate and not really take the nature of the thing into account at all, or we can be elvish with our technology, right? We can build, we can cultivate, we can do what we're meant to do as human beings and allow God to fill and be worshiped through the work of our hands. But notice with all of this, God is worshipped. God has worked with us, and he does still bless and elevate us even through our work. Even when we do it wrong, we can trust that God in his providence has things under control. It's not like God is worried, right? He knows what he's doing. He has things in his providence. Even if he has permitted evil, he can use that for good. Even if our technology is imperfect, he can take our kindergarten scratch and he can do something brilliant with it. I do need to say something about our current age, though, because the cell phone is its own unique thing, right? I know when I go into a public place, I used to work on college campuses, and when I was trying to meet with students in the student union, or I go to places like a grocery store or something, I'm bombarded by all the choices and all the distractions and all the things going on where I can barely focus. I remember trying to have conversations in the student union, and I'm like, I can't focus. There's all these people walking by me. It's because we're meant to focus on things. We're not meant to have all these choices all the time, things constantly bombarding us. And we live in an age now where we have that, right? So it's really interesting when we look at an individual thing. inside that thing is so much for us to learn. And I think you see this in people that become experts in very niche ideas. In one class, we're learning about like division of species of things. And we started to try and define and then subdivide like something really ridiculous like cheese. And by the end, we are creating all these divisions of cheese, and we realized there's so much more to know about this thing. I could get really interested in the making of cheese. And it's not just because I love cheese, which I do, but it's because it's big. It's a concept. It's something real. It's something we've done with God's creation. And if cheese, something as simple as that, is real, how about the grander mysteries? How big are they? So it's interesting because the cell phone, it gives you so many options, so many things to focus on, that it ends up like narrowing our scope because it starts really wide, and then you end up focusing kind of on one thing. It doesn't expand into mystery. It just like locks you into this one thing. And as I was thinking about this, it occurred to me that when I look at one of these things without the use of this device or these crazy technological ages, which are too narrowed, and they as Thomas Howard says, everything is nothing, where it used to be that everything is everything. Um, it narrows our focus when we look at things as they really are. What happens with it is it starts really narrow. It's the thing in my hand, and it grows out and it becomes bigger and wider. This is what ideas are supposed to do when we contemplate them. They start small and they go deeper and larger and bigger. The end of the Narnia series, farther up and farther in. What is eternity? Galloping through reality and going farther up and farther in. It's like a spiral and this never ending just growth and wisdom. There's no just like, well, I got that, it's done, I checked it off, I'm moving. You take the little thing and it grows into almost like a universe in and of itself. Right? All these great mysteries that have the mark of the creator on them. And that's hard to access when you have a supercomputer that's trying to narrow your focus all the time. And it doesn't have in mind contemplation or our good, right? At best, it just has usefulness in mind, but also it's kind of nefarious where a lot of the apps are there and designed to steal your attention so you can never pierce into mysteries, right? And on top of that, I have been worried since before the AI age. I'm worried about how narrow the focus is. I mean, I think Google was the real watershed because whenever I'd ask a question, the first thing I hear back is, well, I Googled it and it said this, right? It's like we've turned off the idea that Google gives us a bunch of sources and maybe even a consensus, but I have to put those into conversation with other things. There's a broader search that needs to go on than I got my answer on Google. In the AI age, I had one friend who played me a country song that an AI generator had written. He's like, this scares me. I'm like, the thing that's scary about that is we have such bad music that you can put it into an algorithm and it turns out. Like, I think the problem is that, right? I think there's a bigger, broader problem. I think there's big problems with AI in and of itself, but I think there's a larger thing going on. And a lot of it has to do with this age of making this like really small device into a portal to like, I don't know, nothingness, dispersion, or whatever. Okay, so given all these things and given the age that we're in, let's come up with some principles. I'm viewing things through this lens. I'm trying to be elvish and not orcish, and I'm in a particularly troublesome time when it comes to technology. So, how do we sort it out, and how do we do this classical education, this orientation to reality through a very not real avenue? Like you're looking at me on a screen and I'm not sitting in front of you, kind of a thing, right? You can only see a narrow part of my room, and even like myself here you can see like head up, kind of a thing. Very strange. In history they write grim fairy tales about that kind of thing. So what do we do in the midst of all this, and how do we utilize this technology in a particularly elvish way or particularly um, well, yeah, human way, so we can behave like Adam? All right, so here's our principles. So in general, when it comes to technology, we need to keep in mind cultivation versus manipulation, right? We're cultivating things, we're cultivating our knowledge rather than manipulating and making things easier. Um, I realized when I was teaching in a brick and mortar school, and I don't think this is just about the school, I think this is about our culture, the main goal of most of the students that I had in class, it was not to learn or to orient themselves in reality or even to like do their best. The biggest thing was for them to get the best grade doing the least amount of work as quickly as possible. Right? That's a manipulation. Right? That's not a cultivation. That's a manipulation. I'm just trying to get this done as quick as possible for my own end or whatever. Right? Technology is meant to be an accent and an adornment rather than an overshadowing or a replacing. Right? So, an AI algorithmic generator is never a replacement for human conversation. If I'm using it that way, that's a problem. It's never meant to overshadow conversation either. So if I'm using it more than I'm cultivating a conversation through it and supplementing it, that might be the wrong way to use it. Am I using to use a less AI generated or AI geared response? Back in the day, we used to go to Barnes and Noble and get a copy of Cliff Notes, and it would, in a shorter version, help you not only read a difficult piece of literature, but it would give you like interpretations and stuff for it. And that's well and good if it's a supplement, an accent and an adornment. I'm reading a really difficult book. Our literary sense is not what it was when the book was written, so I'm struggling through it, and I have kind of a guide to help me navigate this book as I read it myself. That's different than just saying, well, I'm not going to read the book. I'm going to read the cliff notes and then I'm going to write my essay based on what someone else said. Well, that's not how literature works, right? It's supposed to be in conversation with the ideas in my mind. So I don't replace the reading of the book. I can use some of these resources to help me. And also, I need to keep in mind if I'm buying another book on a book, guess who wrote that? A person who has a lens and an interpretation of that book, but not the interpretation, right? And I need to read it more. And I also need to put it in context with a tradition that we know is true through the church, right? The wisdom handed down by the church, right? So accent and adornment versus overshadow or replacement. The mode and the product both matter is another principle. Not just what you do, but how you do it matters. I can research and read different things on a screen, but even like brain science has shown us that we don't retain nearly as well. Especially when I'm scrolling and it's not like I just have a page and I process the stuff on the page and then I move to another page. When I scroll, it's an endless loop and our brain just can't quite wrap itself around that. And if our brain can't, our mind has a hard time wrapping itself around these ideas. Right? So the way we do things and the product both matter. It's not just about writing a good paper or getting an idea summarized. It's the struggling through, how do I put this? What do I say? How do I tone this down so I can put in my own words, or ratchet it up because my words don't like quite capture the weight of this idea, right? Technology needs to be rooted in the real. Okay? We have this idea that if I can think it, I can do it. That's just not true. Right? There's this popular atheistic argument they used why God wouldn't exist, saying, well, can God make a rock that's too big for him to pick up? Because if he can, then he's not all powerful because rock is bigger than him. But if he can't do everything. So he's not, again, all powerful. So therefore he can't exist, or he's not all powerful or whatever. And the problem with that is, well, you just don't get how reality works. Like, God is bigger than material creation. So it's not a problem of God's nature. It's our nature can't equal God's. Just because I think it does not mean that it's real, right? Or possible. So we need to orient ourselves and root everything that we do and cultivate and have as something that's real, right? I already talked about this one. The farther up and farther in that each idea, we can't do this with everything. Like if I look at every, I need to tie my shoes and I start to contemplate that as a great mystery. I wouldn't get much done, So in classical education, we love the absent-minded philosophers that will fall in wells because their heads are up in the clouds and they're not paying attention to what their feet is on. But in a certain sense, we can't do that with everything. But when we learn, we should become fascinated we need to cultivate not just a bank of knowledge like we're a supercomputer that needs files saved here so that we can pull them out. We need to cultivate contemplation. And technology should help cultivate that. If I'm using a technology and I'm not growing and cultivate in contemplation, I haven't been genuinely fascinated in my work in a while, I might be using it wrong. I need to take a step back. We need to remember our whole work here is to offer things back as worship to God, to cultivate his creation and to defend his creation and to defend happiness, the true happiness that he's given to us for us and others, and hand it back to him, right? So like we're contemplating mysteries of God that have his imprint. We need to remember that farther up and farther in. And then to kind of summarize a bunch of these points, I guess I could have taken these on and just put this one, but it supplements, but then it points back to real processes. So if I'm going to dive into technology, it's not an end in and of itself. I need a specific goal, and it does a specific thing. It advances me in a specific way, and then I can set it down and go back to the real process. If I'm going to search something on the internet, I find the information. Maybe I print off an article, I underline, I mark up, but then eventually I'm going to write down a note in my own words. I'm going to get back to that real experience of my hand is moving across something, and I'm batting my way through it. Or I look something up and I get an answer somewhere on the internet, and then I bring it into conversation. I'm going to bring this into conversation with my teacher or a sibling or a friend or a parent, but it's back to a real process. It supplements and then it points us back. Okay. So really quickly, here's some practical applications of these principles, and hopefully this has been helpful. This will be my last slide, and we'll kind of close with the practical applications. So first off, spill ink, dog-ear pages, get your fingers in the dirt, do the real experiments. Instead of just passively watching something, we have to take notes or engage it in conversation or do something where we're putting things in our own words, where we're writing them down, where we are active, we're using our body. So at Oxrose, we use video lectures. And if any of you are anything like me, and I'm assuming some of you are, when a video is on, I start to turn on a passive mode, right? I don't engage with the video. I can watch the whole video. Sometimes I know many students like to speed it up to 2 times speed, right? I know who you are, by the way. Just kidding. But they speed it up because the idea is, well, I got the video done. Again, it's about the mode. It's not about getting the video done. It's about learning from the video. I need to interact. So the benefit of the technology is I can hear something, I can pause it, and then I can write some thoughts down, right? I had a teacher in graduate school who would make us buy his lectures on CD, and the only places I could listen to a CD in 2022 or something, no, it was earlier than that, doesn't matter, was in my car, right? That was the only place. And then eventually I went to a thrift shop or something like that, and I got a handheld CD player in my headphones. It felt wonderfully nostalgic to carry those around. But whenever I was listening, I would have to pause and I would have to play and replay, and that was such a benefit because I'd listen to his explanations again and again, and then I would write them down. But when I didn't have something in front of me, I didn't retain them, right? So we need to get in there. We need to dog-ear those pages. We need to do those experiments. We don't just watch videos of others doing experiments. Get your hands dirty. Second is we need to use words. And one of my favorite phrases in class is we need to 8 years oldify those words, right? That's based on physicist and mathematician Richard Feynman, who is noted as a great teacher. One of the things he would always tell people to do is explain things in their own words. And he was famous for looking at someone and saying, well, why to his students when they were doing like a mathematical proof, and they had to keep explaining it to them. And he would say, use only a vocabulary that an 8-year-old could understand. And if you just repeat what I just said back to you, you might be good at repeating what I said back to you, but you don't understand it. So we need to use our own words and find where we're wrong or where they're insufficient, right? And this idea of just finding answers on Google doesn't help with that. It's not, they're never our own words. Finding an answer, even if I put my own words into ChatGPT and say, fix these, it's not my own words. I'm not wrestling through it, so it doesn't help my understanding. I might get the paper done, but but I've learned nothing from it. It might actually have hollowed me out rather than filled me up. We need to Google proof our assessments. Right? Um, so often when I was working, again, this is a brick and mortar kind of classroom, but I'd have students, I would give them a worksheet or a study guide, and they'd have to read something and fill in the study guide, and they'd say, well, where is the answer to this? I'm like, well, it's in the reading. It will guide your study. I'm like, well, no, like, just like give me a word bank. I don't like this question. I just don't find this exact verbiage or whatever. It's like, oh, you're looking for Google answers. What is this? And then a Google word that just fills it in. No, a study guide, it guides your study. This is going to help you think about this question. The answer's not verbatim in there, but the answer is in the thinking through this article. There's some recall, but not everything is recall. So if our assessments, whether we're doing them at home or in class or whatever, are so easy that Google could ruin your assessment, it's not as great an assessment, right? Harder and harder to do the more Google and AI grows, but as much as possible, we need to think like, how do we challenge ourselves a little bit more, right? Narrow the scope for your technology. So be very specific with the direction for how to use a piece of technology. Right? Cal Newport, who's one of these, he's the digital minimalism writer. He talks about setting intentions for using technology intentionally. Right? So if I'm going to use a YouTube video, I'm going to state my intention so I don't fall down a hole and say, oh, this would be interesting and this would be interesting. No, this is the one thing I'm going to use the video for. If I'm going to Google an answer, I'm going to Google this and this is how I'm going to use it. I'm going to find no less than 5 different definitions of it. And then I'm going to go into conversation with one of my teachers and I'm going to get, their vision of it or where to find it in the textbook and use that. Like I'm stating something specific so I don't fall down the hole. It's like I brought up our technology is there to gain our attention. If I set an intention for it and then I have some way to remind myself, so when I find myself hypnotized by the infinite options of the internet, I know, well, I've gone beyond the scope of what I was using this for. This is especially good for teachers. We have to set the scope for the students using them. Okay? Use answers or insights as part of a conversation rather than an end of the road. If I find myself consistently just going and saying, well, I'm just looking for answers all the time and I'm not looking for sources or to dive into the conversation or to grow in understanding, again, it's how I do it as well as just getting the end, right? There's a point in getting this answer. Right? So always facilitate face-to-face interactions. Get back in a conversation. That's why I love our Zoom classes. These face-to-face interactions that we have with each other, where we have to talk to each other. I can see there's a lot of limits to Zoom, but I can see the faces of the students, and we communicate so much other than just with words that I can understand more of what you're saying when I see your face, right? Socrates was on to something with his concerns. So facilitate face-to-face interactions. The very first schools in ancient Greece were thinkers sitting down in nature or something like nature with each other, having conversations face-to-face, sustained throughout the year. We can never replace that. That is integral to classic education, but it's integral to being a human, right? And then I think last, we need to have a healthy skepticism of technology. I don't think we need to be doom and gloom. Look what God has done in his providence. He's not scared. He knows what he's about. He's permitting things for a purpose. But we should be skeptical. We shouldn't just jump whole hog onto the newest fad. So slow micro experiments and reflections help. I think it was in Cal Newport's book where he talked about the Amish communities. They're not anti-technology, they're discerning about technology. And so they'll vote as a community if they're going to introduce some new technology into their society. And then they introduce it for a small period of time in a specific way. And then after they've lived with it for a while, they sit back and they reflect and say, ought we to adopt this and in what way? And maybe we shouldn't. In the end, that's kind of the conversation they have. So I think these micro experiments are helpful. I'm going to use this technology in this particular way and I'm going to reflect on it. Even writing quizzes for an online academy, there were some types of questions that didn't work for the type of format that I was putting them in the quizzes. I was making history quizzes and things. And I was thinking, well, these are my only options. what I'm trying to get done here with this question is not working when I look at the quizzes that they're taking. Therefore, I need to try a different way of using this type of quiz to get what I want out of it, or I need to change what I'm trying to aim at. There are these little micro experiments. Am I going to have them like click and drag a timeline, or am I going to have them add a number to the timeline? What's the benefit of those two? What am I trying to do here? So we need to have some intention with how we're using our technology, experiment with it, and reflect. All right, so there's some thoughts on technology and classical education. I hope it's helpful, and I hope I haven't bored you to sleep. But if I did bore you to sleep, I hope you have a great slumber.